want to start a small campaign here today to break up the BBC. I want you all to participate in that campaign by firstly agreeing that the BBC should be broken up, and then we'll all work out how to do it. I want to tell you a little bit about the BBC's power and why it is, in my view, the most dangerous opponent that Israel has in the world of, in the media world. The BBC produces 4 hours of news every 1 hour of the day. That's 100 hours of news per day. In the UK, which is by no means the only country that it's active, it reaches 98% of the population every month. Every month, 98% of the population. If you take out babies who are under 2, the small Haredi community who don't have televisions, you're basically reaching 100% of the population of the UK every month. 20 million people in the UK use the website every month. That's as many people pro rata as use Facebook in the USA. Worse than that, the website, which is probably the best funded website in the world, has a huge reach and is now used as a fundamental tool for educationalists in schools. They don't go to send their children to an encyclopedia, they send them to the BBC website on the history and background of any event, current events and history. There's a whole history of the Middle East sitting on the website of the BBC in their style and their story, their narrative. The BBC has something over 2,000 people hired just for dealing with news on a daily basis. That means that's probably the largest single news media organization in the world, more people around the world gathering news. So they have a phenomenal reach. They reach, I'm afraid I don't have the number, but I think it's over 50 countries and many different languages in which they are transmitting. So they're reaching almost the whole world. You can't go to any hotel around the world without finding the BBC available on your television. If you're in Switzerland, you can hear local Swiss news or the BBC. So most international travelers are probably not going to listen to local Swiss news in German or French. They're going to listen to the BBC in English. As a result of this, they have an astonishing reach. A recent article in The Economist suggested that because of the financial crisis, advertising income has gone down, which means that the independent channels that rely on advertising are being squeezed. The BBC's income from tax is at present approximately $7 billion a year. That's $7 billion, which doesn't go down through a lack of advertising because they don't need advertising. With that money, they attract people to watch the BBC. There's a very famous film critic in England called Jonathan Ross. What he does is he watches films and says, this is a bad film, or this is a good film. For that, he gets paid approximately $25 million over the last 3 years. Now, for watching films, that's quite a good salary. He's the best film critic that there is in the UK. So anyone who wants to watch a film critic is going to watch him. The BBC can afford to put him on at $25 million over 3 years because they've got a huge budget. The next program is the news. So then you're watching the BBC News. That's how they draw you in, and that's how they influence you. Why is it important? Because politicians can go and speak, Israeli politicians can go and speak to English politicians. The and persuade them that actually Israel is not the worst state on the planet. However, if that politician's electorate hates Israel, then ultimately the party that they represent is not going to stand up to the electorate. They are going to follow the views of the electorate. All of the democratic countries in the West are subjected to the influence of the media, and they ultimately are going to decide what is the policy, the international policy of the countries and the politicians whom they vote. So actually this battle is becoming frontline. It's more than frontline. It is the most fundamental battle which I think is facing Israel in an existential sense. And the BBC is by far and away the most powerful media organization in the world, and it has a negative attitude towards Israel. I should say another factor, that 63% of people say they trust the BBC. Politicians, journalists, sadly lawyers, don't get anywhere near that high. 63% trust in the BBC. So the general people in the UK believe what the BBC says. If it's true for the UK, it's probably even more true for other people around the world, where the BBC is seen as the voice of truth. Let's have a look at the voice of truth for a moment. This is just, I've produced about 6 or 7 different reports. This is just one, which was an analysis of a few of the Gaza conflict over a year ago now. And I'm looked only at one item, which is Jeremy Bowen, who was the head of the BBC's Middle East Bureau for the whole of the Middle East, and looked at the way in which he analysed what was going on in Gaza. Most of the time, by the way, he wasn't actually in Gaza because he couldn't get in, and he complained about that in every single broadcast he gave, almost. Just so you're aware, the BBC's guidelines, it requires us to be fair, open-minded when examining the evidence and weighing all the material facts, as well as being objective and even-handed. We must ensure we avoid bias or an imbalance of views on controversial subjects. There are few more controversial subjects than the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, and they have a very clear obligation to be impartial and balanced. This is more BBC guidelines, which every journalist is meant to obey. Our journalists, including those in news and current affairs, may provide professional judgments, but may not express personal opinions on matters of public policy, political or industrial controversy. They're not allowed to express public opinions. Now, what Jeremy Bowen did was he wrote a diary, a personal diary. This diary was expressed to be his personal opinions. As the head of the Middle East Bureau for the BBC, he is entitled to keep a diary, but what he did with this diary, which he's not entitled to do, is he put it on the website, and it was actually advertised on a continuous basis throughout the Gaza conflict. So here was the head of the BBC precisely putting out his personal views and saying, these are my personal views. I'm going to look at what those personal views were in a moment. We analysed 58 news items, and of those 58, we found a percentage, and I've forgotten what that percentage is now, unbalanced. Now, most of them were unbalanced. I have no problem with an unbalanced report. Clearly, not every report can put in the entire story. So sometimes you show one side of a story, sometimes another, and there aren't only two sides to any one story. There's many aspects to the narrative. The problem arises is if the unbalanced stories are all from one side or all from another side. The unbalanced stories have to be even-handed in their lack of balance. Let's look at the analysis. I calculated 97% of the stories that were unbalanced were showing a pro-Palestinian narrative. So that is really where the mischief lies. And the fact that some of the reports are balanced actually gives credibility to the BBC because they can show some balanced reports. 97% of those that were unbalanced were telling one side of the story. Now, I'm not, because we've got little time, going to go through the details of what Jeremy Bowen said. I've got a report which is available on the web if you want to look at actual words he used, how he demonizes Israel and refers to it as a state of murderers. You can read that at greater length. I'm just going to go through a few main points here. I will just detail this, where Jeremy Bowen says, many countries say that Hamas is a terrorist group, but in Israel it has built support by helping the poor as well as attacking Israel. One of the great strengths of Hamas is its charitable work. People, especially poor people, have come to depend on it, especially now, today, etc. In other words, he paints a rosy picture of this delightful little charitable organization called Hamas. What he doesn't do is mention that it's registered as a terrorist organization by the EU and the USA, and I believe by the UK as well. He doesn't quote from its charter. There is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are all a waste of time and vain endeavors. And then it goes on to say we're going to destroy Israel. Now, it's fine to talk about Hamas as providing charitable aid to people, which it does, and that's perfectly okay for it to be mentioned, but mention the whole story. He doesn't do so. He gives a number of human interest interviews, some of which are quite balanced and some of which are not. But of the human interest interviews, 82% are of 82% of the civilians, that is, the politicians were fairly even, but the civilians, 82%, almost all of them were Palestinians telling the Palestinian narrative, which of course was not a happy one because clearly they were in Gaza at the time. He interviewed people who have very, very known anti-Israeli views, and they're presented simply as very neutral people, as aid workers. One, Dr. Mads Gilbert, just referring to "this is murder," and he's a doctor and he's talking, sitting from a hospital. These kinds of slurs are constantly being thrown out. And I'm now going to look at the Bowen diary, and the Bowen diary was, again, about 90% unbalanced. What I've found, I've never found with all my research in the BBC, what Jeremy Bowen managed to do. The next slide, unfortunately, isn't here. It should be. It's a circle entirely one colour, because of the unbalanced reports, which is almost all of them in the Bowen diary, 100% are anti-Israeli, attacking Israel for its policy. So here is the head of the Middle East for the BBC, the most respected news organization in the world. He keeps a personal diary, which he's not meant to do. He advertises the personal diary. At the end of news bulletins, it says, if you want to know more, go and have a look at my diary. And here he's presenting a 100% of the unbalanced reports, which is almost every one, 100% against Israel. This is in breach of every single code that the BBC has. I'm going to end by just looking at another report that I did and just showing you the kinds of pictures, because pictures are a very, very powerful weapon. There's one corner of the BBC website which tries to depict the whole world in pictures. And it takes a few photographs each day and puts them on the website. I interviewed the person in charge of the BBC website to ask him what control he has over what the content of this particular corner is. He said, none. I don't attempt to control the pictures at all. They're random. Well, they're random, but they're put up by people that don't like Israel. So let's just have a quick look at, I'm only going to take 3. There were about 100 images, and if you look at the full report, you can look at some of the other images. I'm just going to give you 3 of the images that the BBC puts out about Israel. Here is a delightful image. What we see here is, this is unusual that you can see the faces of the Israeli soldiers. In almost all cases, the Israeli soldiers are faceless in shadow, so they just appear dehumanized completely. What do we have? A kneeling Arab woman and 5 soldiers surrounding her. This is a very, very potent symbol of the weak being oppressed by the strong, the militarist against a woman, etc. Let's look at another. This is a typical picture of the Israeli soldier. The Israeli soldier doesn't have a face, and that's what you find in most of the pictures. He's just a gun. That is all Israel is just a gun. And whereas, again, this is a Palestinian, what's his position? Kneeling. Again, just as we saw in the previous picture. The Palestinians are on their knees, and, okay, he's not a woman, he's an old man. All of the Palestinian pictures are depicted as either elderly men or women or children, very frequently praying, and the Israelis are constantly depicted again and again as faceless, armed, militant oppressors. I think I've got 2 more pictures. This is your typical Palestinian, armed with a pitchfork, very fierce, very scary. You see this romanticized image of the Palestinian, and this is the concept that these are the people that the Israelis are fighting. Left to their own devices, they would simply be having a nice peaceful time in the fields being farmers. That's what they are if it weren't for the Israeli oppression. A very pleasant, delightful image. And the other image, this is an image of a child whose father has been imprisoned and has finally been released by the brutal Israelis, and you see the child finally being reunited with his father. A very, very powerful image. What the father did, why he was in prison, we don't know. Don't ask that question, but you're left with these very powerful images. Put 100 images like this, 1 a week for several months, you get a very, very strong message. That's the kind of message that's being put across by the BBC. My final words: when the telephone was first invented, just like when broadcasting was first invented, there was nobody ready to use it. If you wanted to have the infrastructure for one person, one end of the country, to broadcast to somebody else or to telephone someone else, the government had to pay for the infrastructure, in the belief that eventually it would become sufficiently popular that everyone would use it. That's the historical origin of the BBC. There is no need for that today. We have the infrastructure, there are plenty of competitors, there are plenty of people that can produce all of the programs that the BBC produces. We don't need any national broadcasters today, and the financial and economic rationale for it is gone. And I believe that there is now no longer a rationale, and there's in fact a great danger in putting the huge power of the BBC and the huge power of any national broadcaster like the BBC into the hands of a single organisation. It should be broken up. Thank you very much.